The turbulence hit without warning, and somewhere over the Atlantic, a woman's smug voice cracked into terrified silence. Before that moment, Margaret Ashworth had spent the first 90 minutes of Flight 227 making her disdain for the man beside her impossible to ignore. He'd boarded late, apologizing to everyone in his row, wrestling a battered duffel bag into the overhead bin with hands that looked permanently stained with engine grease. His jacket was the kind of thing you'd find at a thrift store bargain bin, leather cracked at the elbows, a zipper that didn't quite close, a faded patch on the shoulder that might once have meant something. He'd smiled at her, tired but warm, and murmured something about hoping his daughter's soccer game recording would still be there when he landed. Margaret hadn't smiled back. She'd simply pulled her Chanel scarf tighter around her neck and turned toward the window, as if his presence might somehow rub off on her tailored blazer. If you believe people deserve a second look before we judge them, if you believe kindness can survive even in a world quick to sneer, hit like on this video right now, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House, because stories like this one are why this channel exists. His name was Walter Briggs, though Margaret didn't bother learning it until much later. He was 44 years old, a single father raising an 11-year-old girl named Josie on a mechanic's wage that stretched thinner every year. He'd saved for 8 months to afford this trip, not for himself, but to see his estranged brother one last time before hospice took him. The worn jacket wasn't a fashion failure, it was the only one he owned, patched at the elbows by his own clumsy stitching because a new one meant choosing between it and Josie's winter boots. He'd chosen the boots. He always chose the boots. Margaret didn't know any of this. All she saw was a stranger who didn't belong in first class, a mistake in boarding, a man whose very presence seemed to lower the cabin's collective standard of living. When he'd accidentally brushed her arm reaching for his seatbelt, she'd exhaled sharply through her nose, the kind of sound that needed no words to communicate contempt. Some people, she muttered to no one, loud enough for him to hear, shouldn't be allowed to sit up here. Walter had said nothing. He'd simply looked down at his hands, the same hands that had spent decades fixing what others broke, and folded them quietly in his lap. The flight had been smooth for the first hour, the kind of gentle cruising altitude calm that lulls passengers into their phones and their thoughts. Margaret had ordered a second glass of wine and scrolled through photos of a vacation home she was considering, the kind of life Walter's daughter would never see outside of magazines. Then, without warning, the aircraft dropped. Not the gentle dip of ordinary turbulence, but a violent, stomach-lurching plunge that sent gasps rippling down the cabin like a wave. Oxygen masks swayed. A flight attendant stumbled into a seatback. And then the intercom crackled to life with a voice that was trying very hard not to sound as frightened as it clearly was. The captain's words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The co-pilot had collapsed, unconscious, possibly a cardiac event, and the autopilot alone would not be enough to bring 211 souls safely through the storm system now closing in around them. Ladies and gentlemen, the voice said, cracking slightly, if there is a licensed pilot on board, please identify yourself immediately. Silence swallowed the cabin whole. Margaret's wine glass trembled in her hand. Around her, passengers exchanged terrified glances, the particular helplessness of people who suddenly understood how little control they'd ever actually had. Somewhere behind her, a child began to cry. And then, beside her, the man in the worn jacket unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "I can fly," Walter said quietly, and his voice, for the first time since boarding, carried an authority that silenced every whisper around him. Margaret stared up at him, uncomprehending, as a flight attendant rushed to his side. He explained, briefly, that he'd spent 12 years as an Air Force pilot before an injury grounded him, that he'd kept his commercial license current out of stubbornness and love for something he'd never quite let go of, that these days he fixed engines instead of flying them because it paid the bills and let him tuck his daughter in every night. The jacket, he added almost as an afterthought, had been his father's, worn during his own service decades earlier, patched and repatched because some things you don't replace, you honor them. He moved toward the cockpit with the flight attendant, and Margaret watched him go, her earlier words ringing in her own ears with sudden, sickening clarity. Some people shouldn't be allowed to sit up here. She thought of her scarf, pulled tight in silent judgment. She thought of the exhale through her nose. She thought of every assumption she'd built about him in 90 minutes based on nothing but the condition of his clothes, and she felt something inside her chest crack open, raw and exposed. The next 40 minutes stretched like hours. The plane bucked and shuddered through the storm, and passengers gripped armrests in each other's hands, praying in whatever language their fear spoke. Margaret found herself praying too, though she hadn't prayed in years, whispering apologies to a man who couldn't hear them, bargaining with whatever force might be listening. She thought about her own daughter, grown now and distant, and wondered when she'd become someone who measured people by the stitching on their sleeves rather than the content of their character. She thought about how easy it had been to sneer, and how that ease had cost her nothing until this exact moment, when everything suddenly felt like it could cost her everything. Then, gradually, the shaking eased. The clouds outside the window thinned to gray, then silver, then the ordinary blue of open sky. The captain's voice returned, steadier now, informing passengers that the co-pilot was stable and receiving care, that the storm had passed, and that they owed their safety to a passenger whose quick action and steady hands had kept the aircraft level when it mattered most. A ripple of applause broke out across the cabin, hesitant at first, then thunderous, passengers rising from their seats to clap for a man most of them had never noticed boarding. When Walter emerged from the cockpit 20 minutes later, his jacket still worn, his hands still stained, Margaret stood without thinking and found herself crying in front of 200 strangers. She reached for his arm, the same arm she'd flinched from hours earlier, and the apology that came out of her was clumsy and overflowing, all the things she wished she'd said instead of what she had. She told him she was ashamed. She told him she'd judged him the moment she saw him, and that she'd been wrong in every way a person could be wrong. Walter, gracious in a way that made her shame burn even hotter, simply nodded and said that people see what they're taught to see, and that the only thing that mattered now was what they chose to see next. The flight landed safely in the golden light of late afternoon, the kind of soft, forgiving sun that seems to bless a day that could have ended so differently. As passengers filed off, several stopped to shake Walter's hand, to thank him, to ask about his daughter, his brother, his years of service. Margaret lingered near the gate, unwilling to simply disappear into the terminal crowd as if nothing had happened. She asked for his contact information, not out of obligation but out of a genuine, aching desire to know more about the man she'd almost let herself dismiss entirely. In the weeks that followed, she would learn that Josie loved painting more than soccer, that Walter's brother passed peacefully with his hand in his, and that a worn, patched jacket could carry more dignity than any tailored blazer ever could. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the people we overlook are often the ones capable of saving us, please don't scroll past without leaving a comment. Tell us about a time someone surprised you, or a time you learned a hard lesson about judging too quickly. Your stories are what make this community mean something. And before you go, do one small thing for us. Type the word kindness in the comments below, just so we know this story reached you and reminded you of what truly matters. Margaret never wore that scarf the same way again. Every time she reached for it, she thought of a cracked leather jacket and the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent his life choosing others before himself, a man the world had taught her to overlook, and who had, in the end, saved every single person on that plane, including the version of herself she no longer wanted to be.